Hi, students. Today we start Unit 4, Notes 1, which is Growth of the West. Our unit title is Emergence of a Modern America. So we're going to be exploring how life is changing after the Civil War. You should use pages 4 and 5 of your note packet. This is your new note packet for the Emergence of Modern America unit, which is Unit 4. You can see on these notes we have important vocabulary. We have some important people. I noticed that we have some Native Americans on that list, so we could expect to be updated on what's going on there. We have a transcontinental railroad in time zones, and we have homesteaders, miners, ranchers, and American Indians. So, our first note on growth of the West. Settlers have been gradually moving west into territories obtained during the era of manifest destiny. With the rise of the steam locomotive in the early 1860s, Congress and President Lincoln gave approval for federal funding to build a railroad that would span across the continent. This transcontinental railroad would unite the industrialized East with the natural resources found out west. And that's a big key thing there is that it's linking the industries of the East and the natural resources in the West. With the Pacific Railway Act in 1862, Congress gave funding to two companies to build the Transcontinental Railroad. The Union Pacific would link to existing railroad lines and build west from Nebraska. The Central Pacific would start in Sacramento, California, and build east. The government paid the railroad companies in federal land, which would then be divided up and sold off to settlers and businessmen. So, the Transcontinental Railroad of 1862 is where Congress provided money to build railroad tracks across the U.S., connecting the East to the West and linking the economies, linking the resources with the industries. The Union Pacific started in Nebraska and built tracks westward across the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. In 1866, the Union Pacific hired former Civil War General Grenville Dodge to take charge of railroad construction. He had built railroads before the Civil War, and his military experience helped him lead men. He commanded a force of over 10,000 men, most of whom were Irish immigrants. Other immigrants, former Civil War soldiers, and freed slaves joined them. You can see that's an actual picture there of them building the railroad. So the Union Pacific is the railroad company hired by Congress to build railroad tracks from Nebraska west across the Great Plains and Rocky Mountains. We hired many former Civil War soldiers, former slaves, and Irish immigrants to be working on that particular rail line. The Central Pacific faced the task of building track over and through the Sierra Nevada mountains. When many of the workers fled to look for silver in Nevada, the head of construction, Charles Crocker, hired 50 Chinese workers. These immigrants proved to be hard workers, and Crocker sent recruiters to China to bring back more workers. The Central Pacific employed more than 12,000 Chinese who cleared trees, shoveled dirt, blasted tunnels, and laid thousands of miles of track. You can see the picture of the Chinese workers there. So, kind of interesting on the railroads, you got the Union Pacific, where we have former soldiers, and you have Irish immigrants and other immigrants, and in the Central Pacific, really was mainly Chinese workers. Okay. There's Charles Crocker down there in the corner. The railroad company hired by Congress to build railroad tracks from California east, and it hired over 12,000 immigrants, and that's the Central Pacific. If you can imagine trying to blow through the mountains and blast through all that, how much work that would be. I mean, you're talking about building a railroad by inches a day at times. Inches. That's tough progress. On May 10th, 1869, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific came together in Utah Territory at a point called Promontory Summit. A golden spike was driven in to complete the nearly 2,000 miles of track for the Transcontinental Railroad. Ultimately, the railroad would expand to add more lines across the continent. New settlers would flood into the West and establish towns and cities. There you can see a picture of them meeting. You may notice here that the Chinese workers were excluded from the celebration. Their hard work was earned, it was rewarded by losing their jobs. As soon as this was finished, they lost their jobs altogether. Railroads also changed America in a surprising way. They altered time. Before the railroads, each community set time based on the position of the sun. But railroads needed to be able to schedule the departure and arrival of trains. To solve this, the railroad companies set up standard time, and they divided the United States into four time zones. So on your map, top of page 5, you have the Eastern time zone, the Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Please color each time zone a different color. I'm not really picky about what colors you choose, just so that you can see the difference between them. And we'll pause here so you can get that done. We have the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific on there as well. And then Promontory, Utah, you can go ahead and label. On the front of your packet, you have, it's page 2, a Unit 4 timeline. Please put the Transcontinental Railroad completed. Okay. You may have learned a little bit about this in 6th grade as well. Some of you remember the Homestead Act. But the same year Congress approved the Transcontinental Railroad, they also passed the Homestead Act. This new law offered farm families 160 acres of federal land in the West. All they had to do was establish a working homestead by clearing the land, building a home, and farming the land for 5 years. The Homestead Act drew settlers west and attracted foreign immigrants with the promise of land ownership. By 1910, the number of farms in the United States had tripled to more than 6 million. So on page 5, Homestead Act was passed in 1862. It offered farmers 160 acres of land in the West, and settlers must clear the land and farm for 5 years. Okay, and then in your important vocab, the Homestead Act is the law passed in 1862 by Congress that offered farmers 160 acres of public land in the West for free if they cleared it and farmed it for 5 years. Homestead Act. Some new settlers to the West dreamed of striking it rich. In the 1870s, another rush took place when gold and silver were found in many states and territories throughout the West. Boom towns sprung up almost overnight, and most turned into ghost towns when the easy to find gold and silver was gone. The boom towns had no government or law enforcement. Robbery and murder were common, and miners had their own methods of vigilante justice to control crime. So we have the original gold rush of 49, and then in the 1870s we have more of a rush because they found gold and silver, and a lot of that was found in places like Nevada, some of California. They, kind of those states and territories that were out there. Another group of settlers was made up of cowboys and ranchers. Millions of longhorn cattle roamed the Texas plains. Cities out east provided a profitable market for beef. Cow towns appeared along railroad lines where cowboys would herd cattle to ship east. So you can see there's an African American cowboy, Nat Love, over there on the left, but their cattle trails would run north and south up to the middle of our country to meet up with the train lines. And that's where they would load up the cattle to be sent east to the factories and for sale. Very profitable way of living, but not an easy life. So miners and ranchers, gold and silver were found through the West. That attracted all those miners out there with boom towns, and that also brought new businesses west. And ranchers brought cattle to cow towns to be shipped east. The extermination of buffalo. As railroads moved into the West, buffalo hunters followed. Hunters killed huge numbers of the North American bison for their hides and bones. The Plains Indians depended on the bison for food and were horrified by the slaughter. By 1880, the buffalo had all but vanished, and the Plains Indians were left with little choice but to go live on reservations. Their land was in high demand for cattle ranching, mining, and homesteading. That picture is awful, all the horns of the buffalo. There was also war on the plains. Originally, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 gave much of the land west of the Mississippi River to the American Indians. But as the railroad brought settlers, homesteaders, ranchers, and miners west, the Plains Indians watched their land and resources get snatched up once again. Plains Indians hated the idea of living on the reservations, and many tribes resisted. The U.S. Army was sent to force the Indians onto the reservations, and a number of battles took place between American Indians and the U.S. military. So you can see that loss of land. Look at that map, 1850, 1865, 1880 to today. The federal government promised annuity payments, those are those annual payments to Indians on reservations. Often the promised food and money failed to arrive. Federal agents in charge of distributing the payments sometimes were dishonest and sold the food and supplies to white settlers. And you guys heard about that last year when you learned about the treaties of the Dakota and the Ojibwe here in Minnesota. The most famous battle between Plains Indians and the U.S. military took place in present day Montana near the Little Bighorn River. Soldiers found gold in the Black Hills of Dakota Territory. Within months, 15,000 settlers had rushed to try to strike it rich and swarmed onto the native people's land. Instead of restricting the miners, the government wanted to force the Indians out. In June of 1876, George Custer spotted an Indian camp of Dakota and Cheyenne, and he decided to attack immediately. The battle was a disaster for the U.S. soldiers. The Dakota and Cheyenne were led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. They surrounded Custer's men and killed all 211 soldiers. This battle became nicknamed Custer's Last Stand. Okay, so you have some important people here. This is at the Little Bighorn River. George Custer was the U.S. Army officer who led the Plains Wars against American Indians, and he died at the Battle of Little Bighorn. You have Sitting Bull, who's the Lakota chief who led unified tribes in the Battle of Little Bighorn against the U.S. Army. And you have Crazy Chief. He was the one who helped defeat Custer's 7th Cavalry at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So we have quite a bit of Native American resistance that's happening as the railroad and the settlement west is happening. And who's to blame them, too? They got pushed off their land in the east, they've made life in the west, and now they're getting forced off of that land as well. Not to mention all of the tribes that were already in the west that are now being faced with the problems that the US government's pushing on them, and the loss of food with the buffalo hunting. The Battle of Little Bighorn was the last major victory for the Plains Indians. The government responded by increasing military presence in the West. In 1877, Crazy Horse surrendered, and Sitting Bull and his followers fled to Canada. In 1881, the starving band returned and surrendered to the U.S. Army. They were escorted onto reservations. The federal government ignored all previous treaties, and Congress took the Black Hills and 40 million acres. In 1887, Congress passed the Dawes Act. This new law divided up reservations to give individual Indians their own land to farm. It also created boarding schools for American Indian children. The purpose of this was to encourage natives to adopt white culture. And that Battle of Little Bighorn is the most famous battle of the Plains Wars. The U.S. soldiers attacked and they were killed by Lakota Indians. There's a big monument to Crazy Horse going up in the Black Hills area of South Dakota, and it's being carved out of the rock. It's pretty cool. If you ever get a chance to see it, they're still working on it, but it's a pretty neat monument to Crazy Horse. They have a whole visitor center with the background and such. Okay, and then American Indians in that category put hunters killed herds of buffalo, the Plains Indians' main source of food. And wars took place as they resisted being forced onto reservations. And this concludes your notes for Unit 4, Notes 1, Growth of the West.